Now, over the last 2.5 years, me and my wife have transformed our garden into our dream garden. We've got the productive growing space here in front of me. We've got a lovely sort of sunken fire pit, sort of seating area, and we've now got loads and loads of planting put in place. However, designing a garden is no easy feat, and it certainly wasn't something we could do ourselves. We were fortunate enough to be able to contract out to a landscape garden designer to help us with our garden. And today's video, I'm able to interview that landscape garden designer to give you, the viewers, some tips on how you can do it yourself. So if this spring you're looking to do up your garden, revitalize it, or completely redesign it, maybe you've moved into a new house, then this is the video for you. Now, in the interview, we cover everything from stage one and how to sort of set out the concept for your garden, all the way through to planting plans and how to save money on materials and the hard landscaping. And I'm really happy with the interview. I think it went really well. And if you like this sort of content, do like and subscribe. Hope you enjoy the video. So thanks, Tom, for agreeing to do this interview. It's obviously the first for the channel, so we're going to see how this goes. But no, I really appreciate your time today. So obviously a quick introduction for yourself, for the viewers. You're Tom, you're the founder of Compass Gardens Landscape Limited. You've got over 10 years experience. You've designed, you contributed designing a gold medal winning Chelsea Flower Show garden. You've appeared in the Sunday Times, and the list goes on there, but you've done a lot of gardens in your time. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this video is really just to get a bit of an understanding in what makes a good garden and how to go about designing your gardens. But before we get into that, one of the big questions I really wanted to ask you was, how did you get into this field of work? Because it's not something that typically when you're at school talking about careers or something that people even realize exists. So I was wondering if you could just give a bit of a background on that.
Yeah, no problem at all. Like many garden designers, it is a second career. I actually started out at university as a secondary school science teacher, and I was in that field for 9 or 10 years, and I absolutely loved it. But it was a moment when I'd worked in a school in Hertfordshire for about 8 years, and I'd developed a load of the outside spaces as part of my role in the science department. And then I moved to an international school in a city, and straight away realised that I'd lost something from my character.
Yeah,
And
okay.
over the next couple of years working there, I found myself kind of being drawn back to working with plants, working outside, and really the horticultural side of life. So it was just a case of working out how best to do that. And I was lucky enough to kind of get a place on the professional training course with a really successful garden designer
Oh, brilliant.
in Bristol, who kind of taught me everything, and kind of then sent me out into the world to try and make it work on my own.
Oh,
I'm still here.
yeah, no, brilliant career change from science teacher to this. I suppose
Yeah,
there's biology elements that maybe come
exactly.
across.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, no, brilliant. Um, So obviously, me and you, we've been working on this garden in particular over the sort of probably 2.5 years, I think now, since you first came out, and there's been a lot of work that we've done. And one of the things that blew me away when we were undertaking this project was how well structured everything is. It's very much a case of you come out on that first site visit, you know what you want, and then even now when we've been doing the planting today, it's very structured. The orders here, exactly where there's nice plans and everything. And I was wondering if you could sort of summarize, for the viewers at home, how you go about approaching a new project. How do you sort of break things into chunks, I suppose?
Yeah, and it's really important to remember that if anyone's thinking about becoming a garden designer, you would imagine it is a purely creative, aesthetic experience, but actually you are also running a business. So the structure and the approach, as you mentioned, it's critical to actually making the project a success. And I'd suggest to people it's far more a technical process than a lot of people realise. So I tend, unless there's a real kind of bespoke model required on a project, I tend to stick to the same stages every time after the proposal's been accepted. Number one, we measure up the garden, we carry out a topographical survey, and using that survey, we produce a range of concepts. In that process, we don't worry too much about specifics on materials or dimensions, but we just throw ideas on a piece of paper. We get back together with the client, and we see what resonates, what sticks. From that, we start developing quite a formal outline plan of the garden, and with that comes all the supporting documentation. And I think going back, this is the part people don't really realize is there, but it's critical. Setting out construction
Yep,
details,
yep.
drainage plans, electrical plans if needed, CDM, health and safety type
Mm.
documentation, full written specification. All of this is a pack to provide to the landscaper, so the client gets an accurate fixed price quote and the project is delivered as it's been designed. If you don't have that supporting documentation, I think you're quite vulnerable to not getting what you want. And you have got to remember that, you know, there's people's money at stake. So, you know, we don't always get it right, but it's really important to at least try and stick to that structure. Um, Following that, we'll arrange the build, and we work with kind of trusted landscapers that we know are reliable and are going to do a good job. And then you start getting into the planting and the implementation of that side. And that's where we are today, kind of
Yeah.
fulfilling the end of the project and getting the plants in.
Yeah, no, that's a really good summary, and I know that was a big learning for me working on this project was how much goes into turns, you know, from cubic meters of gravel to your surface area for your pavement. The idea of double digging your flower bed. There's so many things to think about when you're doing this. So for those at home who may be thinking this spring they want to redo their garden and they want to revitalize their outdoor living space, I wanted to ask you a few sort of questions on those stages that you've talked about. And obviously one of the first stages is to come up with a concept and a design. And I really enjoyed that bit. It's such a, like you said, almost a very creative bit, but arguably it's a really critical piece to make sure you, as the client, gets what you want. So other than this sort of client brief, when you come out to a new project and you're surveying a garden, what sort of aspects do you consider before producing a concept?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And obviously, you've got the brief in mind, so you've got certain practical and logistical things to consider. Is there a tool shed required? People get very concerned about where their washing line's going to go, and the bin store, and you've got all of those factors in the mix. But beyond that, you're also thinking, right, where's my evening sun? Where's the sun moving in the daylight? Thinking
Yeah.
of ways to get people out into the garden. But you've got to focus on the design principles. And this is one of the things I learned when I trained. An outdoor space, much like an indoor space, if it's going to work well and work well aesthetically, needs to have considered certain principles. These are balance, harmony, the use of space.
Okay.
Your patio, if it's far too big compared to your lawn, feels oversized, and the lawn feels too small. If it's the other way around, you feel pinched when you're on the paving. So the concept phase is really important to get the shapes down. Just start off with a pencil and paper and start rubbing things out and moving things around. And there's always a point, I find anyway, where it looks and feels right. It's something quite hard to explain, but there'll be a dimension of things where the shapes are in balance with each other, and you start with those shapes and then you start filling the voids, and they can be pathways, they can be areas of planting, and you do that in such a way to fit in with your big shapes. And it's basically a bit of Lego, a bit of Tetris, but there's a point where you're like, that feels right. And as the project then develops and as it's marked out on site, you can make further little tweaks to make sure it fits. But overall, it's a real fundamental design principle, the harmony of shapes, which you might not consider if you were working on your own garden. But if you've measured it out properly, I would really advise people to scribble and scribble and scribble before you put a spade in the ground.
Yeah.
There are factors to consider as well. When you come to, say, the shape of a patio or the size of a patio, your slabs, we try and minimise cutting of slabs for landscapers. Your slabs in this garden, Luke, they're 600 by 600, but there are 300 by 600s at the end, which means that the
Okay. Yes.
landscaper,
Yeah.
if they cut a slab in half, they can use both halves perfectly
Yep. Yeah.
without any wastage. So all of that comes into the planning as well.
Yeah. No. So yeah, I guess what you're saying there is the scale of your sort of items in your garden. They need to sort of harmonize a bit and make sense together. No, very interesting. So yeah, once people at home they've sketched out, they've drawn something, and they're happy with the concept and the scales looking right and things. They're then going to want to move over to a bit more of a sort of construction in terms of the big part there is materials. And I know I was blown away by the possibilities and the choice of materials from different woods on your deckings all the way from lovely sort of hardwoods to your sort of cheap you know usually sourced softwoods, and then you've got different patios, different gravels, different timber edging, wood for your gazebos and things like that. It's a really vast set of choices to make. And the other thing, obviously, that comes with it is price. The different materials have a different price tag and things. And the investment of the hard landscaping will, without a doubt, be the biggest investment people make in their gardens. So, on that note, for the viewers at home, is there any sort of tips on how redesign their garden, people can save money when it comes to materials and the hard landscaping?
Yeah, it is a difficult thing, and there's no doubt having your garden landscaped is not cheap. Materials costs ever since the pandemic have risen pretty steadily. Um, there are lots of things you can do to try and save money, and first of all, it's really focusing on where the investment is worth it. And using your garden as an example, we focused on where we might want to sit and enjoy sunlight, where we might want to have dining. And even though we didn't want to surround that all with too much turf or too much planting, we've used gravel as a kind of infill, which is very economical to use and is perfect for these infill areas, where we've really focused your investment in the paving on where it's most going to be used. There's a huge spectrum of building materials, as you mentioned, and you do have to be careful that you don't enter too much of a false economy. Fencing's a really good example. As the most expensive fencing often carries with it a 25-year guarantee, which is really worth considering before going and buying very cheap, very flimsy fence panels that you may have to replace twice, 3 times, 4 times in that 25-year period. So you do want to think very carefully, and it's like anything really. Having a higher budget, it gives you a bit more choice, maybe a few more options in terms of fine detail in the gardens, but really focusing on where the investment is worth it. Trees are a really good example as well. You can buy a small whip tree for just a few pounds. You might be waiting 10 years before that's achieving its aim. If you want instant impact, you need, that costs you a little bit more, but do you need that everywhere, or do you need it in a key junction in the garden? So it's just trying to be clever. What I have found that for people that are really trying to minimize costs completely, is and sourcing things secondhand or reclaimed. That is possible. There's a huge world out there of leftover slabs using kind of online marketplaces, etc. The cost of that, as far as beyond the cost, is your time. So in those situations, I found people have had to spend a huge amount of time and admin on arranging that, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. But it's just worth bearing in mind. You can pick up cheap building materials which are surplus or reclaimed, but you will need to hunt around and arrange deliveries, things like that. So it's focusing on where the investment's worth it, and focusing on what materials are worth it is the most economical way to
No, I think that's brilliant advice, especially about the sort of upcycling of things. And like you pointed out there, you can almost always find slabs and things. But I think what we did here with the gravel was key, because the square meter of gravel compared to the square meter of patio, it's night and day. It's very different. And you can get a really good look, I think, with the different textures that we've gone for here and the different materials.
Totally agree. Yeah.
So obviously, you've sort of done your concept, you picked your materials, and maybe you've started building whatever it is you've designed. And then the sort of last step, or the last key to the puzzle, is the planting. And again, this has been a huge learning curve for me. And I'm not necessarily a horticulturalist. I love the vegetable growing. That's what the channel is about. That's what I've sort of my sort of first love. But I've started to really enjoy getting into the perennials and the different planting choices. But I think a lot of people are maybe put off trying things in their garden because it can be a bit of a trial and error. Plants don't always succeed. They don't always grow. Some of them die. And, that can not only be frustrating, but it's costing money and things and time. So Really, as someone who designs a lot of gardens, have you sort of come across plants that are your sort of staple plants that in almost any garden across the UK you would advise people growing, and why?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first step is really to, and there's a principle we try and stick to, try our very best. And as you say, there is always, even for the biggest horticultural experts, there is always a slight element of trial and error. And you can have two plants next to each other in exactly the same conditions that perform very differently. And, there will be a reason, but, who
Who
knows?
knows? Yeah.
Someone will know. But we try and stick to the principle right plant for the right place. So you need to take into account the soil conditions,
Yeah.
the environmental factors in the garden, the crosswinds, the average temperature in the garden, the soil pH. You've also got to think on the maintenance kind of contribution from the customer, and there are plants which tend towards more low maintenance type gardens, as opposed to customers that are outside and prepared to deadhead things every day and all of that. As far as really reliable plants, the geranium family, particularly geranium roseanne, they have a very long-lasting flowering period. They tend to be happy in any soil, in any sunlight conditions. There's a range of grasses. We stick to pennisetums. We really like the steeper grasses. If some people aren't too keen on ornamental grasses, but with climate change, it does seem to be a really clever way to get winter interest into the garden as well, and long-lasting kind of interest movement. You've got if you're looking for something which is going to be really reliable, I would consider more native species, things which have got thousands of years of evolution in the UK conditions, albeit with some climate change factored in. Yew, holly, native trees. There's quite a wide range of native perennials and grasses as well, and of course all of these things are really good for local ecosystems and butterflies and butterfly larvae. So if in doubt, stick to native would be my main advice.
Yeah, no, yeah, brilliant advice, and quite happy to have some yew and holly here in the garden as well. Is there any plants? Sort of counter question: is there any plants you don't like or you don't recommend? Maybe they're too risky, they're likely to die, or maybe they're too high maintenance and simply they never look good. Is there any particular plants you'd advise against for the average gardener?
There's obviously there's plants which personally, from an aesthetic perspective, I don't really like. Larger shrubs that have kind of a messy habit, the Forsythium vigulas, and they're not personally my favourite, whereas other people might absolutely love them, and flowering wise they're both great. But if you were nervous about looking after your plants, I'd really take care to check that the plant is winter hardy in this. And if you go into a lot of garden centres, they're not always totally obvious, because the plant looks so spectacular in the garden centre. What is and isn't going to make it through the winter? Tree ferns are a really good example. They're very expensive, but in the garden centre they look amazing. But they really need a lot of care over the winter months. They need wrapping up. They need insulating. I think other Mediterranean type species like olive trees, again, they're an expensive investment, and if it gets down to -5, -6, you're at real risk of losing it if you haven't protected it. Again, it does come back to trying to use native species, but also doing your due diligence. Use the RHS website is brilliant for advising you on soil conditions, on hardiness. You do go through that process, work out what type of soil you've got, and then use the RHS website to plan accordingly, and you can't really go wrong.
Yeah, no, it's definitely it's a great tool for if you're in a garden centre to just do a bit of a look up and just sort of see, is this going to suit me back home? No, that makes a lot of sense. Cool. So the sort of final question, and we've talked a bit there about plants, but the bit that I think I would find the most daunting design my own garden would be the planting plan. So you've got a big long border. Where do you put plants? How do you position them? The colors, the foliage, the heights of them. Have you got any sort of basic rules that you follow when people are creating their planting plan?
Yes, and as you said, as you referred to, there's so many things to consider: flowering times, heights, the trying to get as much interest through the year as you can, I always start first of all with thinking about how the garden's going to look in the winter. So you
Okay.
think of you look for the evergreen structure, um, and you place those shrubs or trees, that evergreen structure at key junctions, the end of things, in corners. You try and hide corners of the garden using those type of plants. And you think, when all the perennials and grasses have died back, this is what I'm going to have to look at. So what kind of interest are they bringing me? Secondly, you look for height. Trees are a brilliant way, if appropriate in the space, of achieving that, and really the more trees the better. But you do need to make sure there's enough space for the tree, that the tree can breathe, and the tree's not going to be under too much pressure with what's around it. Thirdly, then, yes, you're looking at flowering times. You're looking at some spring interest all the way through the year. What's going to be getting me outside to look in October, November? Is there anything we can put in which flowers in January, beyond, say, kind of bulbs? But are there any
Snowdrops, yeah.
perennial, snowdrop, etc.? Things like grasses are, again, really useful for that, because you can leave that structure on over the winter. Echinacea tends to stay pretty upright as a really lovely perennial. It turns brown, but when there's frost on that dead flower head, hydrangea's the same. It looks amazing.
Almost golden. Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. So you're trying to consider that all through the year, and just keeping that interest. Then you've got the balance of the plan, and try and avoid what I call bubblegum planting, where you've got one of everything in a small space. You plant in groups. That's where you get maximum impact. You tend to try and stick to odd numbers for those groups: 3s, 5s, 7s, if you've got the space. I set them out in groups like that, and then play around with them a little bit, just to make it more interesting, not to make it look too obvious that they're grouped. But generally, if you can get some repeats through the garden, it's very impactful. If the salvias dotted all around are all flowering at the same time, it can really make the garden feel cohesive. And so you tend to develop that as you go, and, as you say, learn by trial and error. And it is difficult. It is a fine art, I'd say, and it's not something I claim to be. I haven't nailed by any means, and I love watching the real world-renowned planting experts. But the level of detail is immense that goes into it. So don't take it lightly. But your first step is really focusing on things that are going to do well in your soil and your wind conditions and your light conditions, and then playing with that combination.
Yeah, no, I think that's some brilliant advice there. And I think that's probably the biggest challenge to it is, unlike like a room in your house whereby you place an ornament here and an ornament here and it stays put, everything stays the same. The garden varies season to season and even year to year as things get bigger and things. So, no, I think that's some brilliant advice there. So that sort of concludes the interview. I just want to say thanks again for your time. Thanks again for sort of sharing this with my viewers on Wiltshire Veggies. And for the viewers at home, if you want to find out more about landscape garden designing, I'll put a link to the sort of Compass Garden website where you can sort of view all the sort of information that's on there. I think there's even a blog as well where you can follow along. And yeah, thank you all for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Done, mate.
Nice.
Easy.